Okay, good evening. I'll introduce myself in just one moment, but I'd first like to make an announcement about this space's accessibility. The community room is T-coil enabled. If you have T-coil enabled devices, please feel welcome to switch them on at this time. If you don't have a T-coil enabled device but would like to use one of our headsets, we have made some available on top of the piano. I'll also request that you silence your cell phones for the duration of this program. My name is Cliff Robinson, and I'm the Public Humanities Specialist here at the Princeton Public Library. Tonight's program was made possible in part with support from the National Endowment for the Humanities. It's my honor to introduce our two guests tonight, Jennifer Roberts and James Welling. Jennifer Roberts is the Gilpin Faust Professor of Humanities at Harvard University. She is an art historian whose scholarship focuses on the interface between the arts and the natural sciences and the history and theory of craft and materiality and the history of print. In her scholarship in curating, Roberts emphasizes the material intelligence of art and its makers and the challenge of storing and transmitting meaning through space and time. In 2012, she curated the exhibition Jasper Johns in Press, Crosshatch Works, and the Logic of Print for the Harvard Art Museums. That project sparked her interest in the generative power of the physical operations of printing: pressure, reversal, separation, strain, interference, and alienation. And that led to her forthcoming book with the Princeton University Press, based on her Mellon lectures, titled Contact, Art, and the Pull of Print. So we have this, it's forthcoming still. We have it tonight, thanks to the publisher, but it is still forthcoming. This book, which synthesizes her contributions to the 70th Annual A.W. Mellon Lectures for the National Gallery of Art, achieves a new grammar for understanding the meaning and significance of print by focusing upon physical operations or maneuvers through which prints come together across media. Roberts is able to ground the printmaking of various artists, schools, and historical chronologies in the body and its ability to apply forces. In this way, she achieves a perspective on printmaking which overcomes the balkanization of humanities and arts disciplines to reveal what she calls print's medium generativity, that is, a model of embedded material intelligence that assumes that specific ways of thinking arise in specific material operations, but can then go on productively to perturb other spheres of activity. Jennifer is joined in conversation tonight about her new book by James Welling, a photographer whose work has been the subject of a number of significant survey exhibitions. In 2014, he was a recipient of the Infinity Award given by the International Center of Photography in New York. And in 2016, he received the Julius Schulman Institute Excellence in Photography Award from Woodbury University, California. From 1995 to 2016, he was area head of photography at UCLA. And since 2012, he has been a lecturer with the rank of professor at Princeton University. Please welcome James Welling and Jennifer Roberts.
Okay. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I think we agreed that I would start off with just a few notes about the book, for those of you who aren't familiar with it or haven't picked it up. First, I just want to thank the Princeton Public Library and all the various sponsors of this event. And it's such a joy to have my very first book event be here in the city where the book was published, with Princeton University Press. And I'm really thrilled that Michelle Comey and Annie Miller from the press are here, and thank them for everything they did to get this book done and out the door. And Jim, it's just a thrill to be here with you. Over the past month or two, I received 2 elaborate, effusive emails from friends who told me I absolutely had to meet Jim Welling. I had to meet this guy who was so interested in print. And I knew Jim, of course, as a photographer, but I did not know that you had this really extensive background in print and printmaking. So it's a thrill to be able to be here with you to talk about this from the angles of intersection that we might be able to find between print and photography. And I'll just say something about this book that I would like to emphasize is that while it is a book about print, what it's really trying to do is open up new methods of thinking about the relationship between print and other media, between print and painting, between print and textiles, photography, even sculpture. The book is just as much about other media as it is about print in many ways. So, as I think we'll hear from Jim, Jim, you've had a long history with print. Your father was a printer, printmaker. But I really come to it from elsewhere. I'm more or less a novice in print and printmaking. My father was an orthodontist. And the closest I got to printmaking, actually, which was pretty close, was that I worked in his lab over the summers to make money. I made the retainers. So if you ever had braces and had to wear a retainer, I was back in the lab bending those wires and making retainers. But that was also very much a process of casting. So I'd make molds of people's teeth and making plaster models. So I was always thinking about negative, positive relationships and definitely thinking about the body and negative, positive relationships. But that wasn't exactly printmaking. And I got my PhD in art history at Yale, and at that time, that was 2000, I couldn't have told you the difference between a lithograph and an etching. I knew nothing about printmaking. No one asked me to know anything about printmaking. It was kind of a blind spot in art historical education, at least where I was at Yale. My specialty was 18th and 19th century American art and then modern and contemporary art, and those were two places where print and printmaking really wasn't part of the conversation. In modern and contemporary art, it was all about photography, actually. This was the 90s, and I was coming through the sort of postmodern era, and Metro Pictures and Jim Welling were, the photography world was the really exciting world of reproductive media, but print really was just completely absent from my education. My dissertation was about Robert Smithson, who I was later amused to realize was an artist who never made a single print. But I was really interested in a few things that eventually led me to this position. So I was deeply interested in materials and what I like to think of as the literalism of art. So what's the relationship between the literal matter that a work of art is made of and the sort of lyrical, transcendental meaning that it somehow manages also to have? So I was very interested in that. I was interested in looking at media that were sitting at the edge of the fine arts. I wanted to learn about furniture and the decorative arts, and I was always moving outside of the world of painting. And then finally I became extremely interested in the intelligence that is lodged in and embodied in the act of making. And this is something that art historians aren't always interested in, or haven't been until quite recently. What kind of knowledge and intelligence does an artist have making something? And what kind of knowledge does an art historian have writing about it, contextualizing it, historicizing it, theorizing it? And how can these two forms of knowledge be brought together? This was something that I was constantly working on, theorizing and thinking about. And it was from that perspective, when I first stumbled into printmaking, that I just found myself gobsmacked by the richness and complexity of the processes that go into making a print. I still remember the day I fully realized that every time you want to make a print, somewhere in the process, the information has to be reversed. Every print comes out of an act of reversal. And for me, that was just a gong going off in my head, because how can that not get deeply into the very kind of core of our experience of the world and the body and our understanding of sort of the other side of things. So these were the kinds of perspectives that I brought to printmaking. And from the perspective of someone who's interested in making, print is fascinating. And I really wanted to be able to pass this along to my students. I wanted to be able to hand them a book that would sort of open them up to all of these fascinating things about printmaking that were so interesting to me. But I realized that there wasn't this book that I needed to have. I needed a book that could take us through all of the different elements of printmaking and excavate the meanings that might come from those elements. But I wasn't able to find it. It's scattered around the print literature. So I ended up doing lectures and teaching and building up a way of talking about certain essential maneuvers or material processes in print. I also found that the print community and the print literature tended to be quite isolated. No one in my department at the time was really very interested in print. The students didn't know where to go to learn about print in the major journals in art history. There really isn't very much discussion about print and printmaking. It's kind of a blind spot in the field, as I mentioned. So I decided what this book is essentially about is what would happen if we just reorganize the way we think and talk about print. What if we just bracketed out the question of reproduction, which is the first thing people think about when they think about printmaking. It's about making copies. What if we just bracketed that out and looked at everything else that's going on when a print is made? So each of the chapters of the book is based on one of these other things that's happening when a print is made. There's pressure, reversal, separation, which is about how color works in printmaking, color separation. There's a chapter called Strain, which is largely about screen printing and pushing ink through stencils. There's a process called interference, which is about essentially the moire effect and all the interference effects that happen when you, say, put a halftone through a halftone or put a halftone on a digital screen, all of the ways that prints interact with each other and create these surprising effects. And then the last chapter is called Alienation, and it's about the kind of reversal of time in printmaking. And that's just a sort of basic overview of the book, but one of the things that I wanted to do in reorganizing the discussion, the way we discuss print was, as I mentioned, to open print up to other kinds of ideas that don't necessarily come out of copying or reproduction. So, for example, if you think about the question of reversal, you also can think about things like photography, which also has its own reversal processes. There are all kinds of ways in which reorganizing print allows us to attach different kinds of receptors to it so that it can be recognized by other fields where it hadn't really been recognized before. So along the way, this became a set of lectures that I gave as the Mellon Lectures for the National Gallery of Art in 2021. Those were supposed to be at the National Gallery of Art, but it was the middle of the pandemic, so I did them all in the spare bedroom in my house, which was actually really just a closet. As I mentioned in the preface, I mean, I was just sitting there. I had borrowed studio lights, and there was laundry all over the floor. Everything was a mess, as everyone's life was during that period. So I did those lectures on video, 6 lectures, and as is common with the Mellon Lectures, you are supposed to turn them into a book. And I was really pleased with the way the lectures went. So the book is only a very moderately edited version of the lectures. So if you liked the lectures, the book is slightly edited. It has fewer images, unfortunately. But it also, I think, is useful to have, hopefully for teaching and to have on your bookshelf. One of the things that I most want this book to do is to be accessible to everyone who's even remotely interested in printmaking, including first-year printmaking students. And in fact, what's been most gratifying to me, I think, over the past couple of years as people have responded to the Mellon Lectures and to the ideas in the lectures is that a lot of printmaking faculty have told me that they're assigning it to their students and that it is sort of getting out there as something for printmakers to think about, and this makes me very happy. So maybe I'll stop yammering for now. Any questions?
I found out about Jennifer watching those lectures. I was scrolling around, I discovered the National Gallery's series of lectures, and something on printmaking. I only watched the first talk because I got too excited, and too many ideas were just like popping out of my head after the first lecture. So I was able to fill in, when you sent me the book, I could read the rest of them.
Okay.
But it's often the case that sometimes the first go at something gives you the most ideas, not that the rest of the book would have been great too, I come to printmaking because tomorrow would be the 100th birthday of my father. And he worked for a printing company, as Jennifer said. And he was a salesman when I remember him. But before that, he worked on the press room floor in Hartford, Connecticut, printing books, and letterpress, and all kinds of printmaking stuff. So I grew up with big press sheets on the dining room table and a loop, looking at the misregistration of the, how to read the screens and things. So I right away was attuned to at least offset printing. I went to Carnegie Mellon and had 2 years of foundation. So the first, actually the 2 years we did intaglio the first semester, then lithography, and then my sophomore year I did silkscreen and then linoleum printing. So I had that as a basis, but then I went on to California Institute of the Arts, which was a very radical school, and it was non-traditional, completely no tradition. And so I'm really happy that I had this, at least foundation in printmaking. But remarkably, when I got to Cal Arts, I worked in video. And video is not something that I think you talk about in your book, but I'm going to teach a class in the fall on photogram. And I've been thinking a lot about the photographic photogram and its ramifications, and it overlaps a lot with printmaking. But one of the things about the photogram is this kind of instant image. You put objects on a piece of photographic paper, and there you have it. And when we started working with video, there was no, you made a videotape and you had a monitor. It was right there, this direct relationship to making art. So in a way, one of the things that I've been thinking about after reading your book and thinking about this class is this idea of a direct work of art. Not that printmaking is that direct, but monoprint, or a remarkable work that you talk about, John Cage's fire prints. It's instantaneous, where Cage lights a piece of paper and runs it through a press, and you have this burned hull. So there's that sort of almost destructive way of making a print, which I was very surprised to read about. I do have to correct you, Smithson did make one print.
Oh.
And it was a multiple. Maybe it wasn't a print. It was issued by Marion Goodman in like 1967. He took a square photograph and ripped it into
Yes.
4 quadrants. So I
That's
bought
great.
that for $75.
Yes.
But
I love it.
so printmaking. So I sort of did the course of printmaking as a student, but then I fell in love with photography, and for maybe 4 or 5 years, I only made what are known as contact prints, where you place the negative in contact with a sheet of paper and you make an exposure and you get a very small photograph. And of course, in photography, there's a cult around the contact print is the sharpest, Weston, Stieglitz, Strand, contact print. Eventually I got an enlarger and made larger pictures, but this early experience of the contact print didn't really bring me to printmaking, but it's allied with printmaking. I forget how, I took some notes on the train, but how I made that connection to printmaking. I also worked with a Xerox machine in the early 70s, and Xerox art, xerography, is a completely under-recognized printmaking form. Also, at Carnegie Mellon, an interesting character showed up to do a visiting artist lecture, Stanley William Hayter, who, the legendary studio, I forget the name of it, in Paris and New York.
I'll tell you 17.
Sorry, what
I'll
was it?
tell you 17.
Yes. So, he talked about Pollock, and it's like, for an art student in 1970, someone who had met Jackson Pollock, it was kind of like, today I was telling Nick in the Cage joke that I met Basquiat. And it was like, they got all excited. So this guy, Hayter, had met Pollock. But he showed us, prints. And so recently, in the last few years, I've been looking at Hayter's work again and also reading about his multiple color intaglio prints and things like that. And also, I pick up different things about printmaking. So it's, this event tonight is a way for me to assemble all of my little collage of printmaking interests, but Jasper Johns, as I understand anecdotally, he has a favorite printmaker. His last name is Gabor. I forget his first name. And I haven't really confirmed this, but someone said they saw there's a poster of this guy. And he's written a book about printmaking. And I said, this is one of Jasper's favorite printmakers. But so I collect technical books, because even though I don't make a lot of prints, I like to read about them. I read about old photo processes. It's just like my hobby. And so I've got a lot of books now on printmaking. And I read them. I don't make that many prints. In fact, most of the prints that I make are inkjets. Occasionally, things I etching press, but I think there's a lot of adjacency in photography and certain photographic processes to printmaking. Of course, the most direct one is the transfer process, which is a very arcane and almost completely extinct photographic process where you make color gelatin transfers of dyes to a piece of paper. So there, photography and the etching press of the brayer really come together. But in fact, all photographic processes involve layers, they involve separations, they involve a reversal, or the idea of front and back is deeply embedded in the photograph. And I always thought there's no back to a painting, but a photograph can always have a front and a back with a negative. So there are these relationships that, reading your book, just inspired me to think more about printmaking and these modalities. So when you asked me if I would, be on this stage, it was really exciting to kind of put our minds together thinking about prints.
Right. No, I mean, I think something that I've been making a big list of future dissertations related to print, because I'm not going to be able to follow all of the little ideas that have come up while writing this book. And so luckily I teach at the university and I have students, and so I can just make suggestions. But one of them, I made a little list of them actually. I could go over them. I have a student who's doing a dissertation on embossing, so taking this idea of the inkless intaglio print, where you have an image that's partially a relief sculpture and partially an image. This is the kind of thing that when you think about,
Yeah, well, I got something to say about that too. Yeah.
When you really think about print as something that is made by pressure, and it involves the deformation of the support of the paper, and it's something that has a front and a back, and every engraving actually is like a little embossing in essence that happens to have ink on it.
And embossing is something that relief is something that is in photographic negative. Microscopically, photographic negatives have relief and dimension. So it's the photographic, the gelatin and the emulsion are a kind of embossment of the light causes, chemistry causes it.
Right,
So
exactly, right. Right, and I think, so the Xerox is just fascinating as a printing format. There's this whole world of office printing in the mid-20th century, Xerox, Ditto, dye transfer printing, all of these, the ways that print began to move out into everyday office or schools. And then, of course, there's so many interesting kinds of printers that are being developed now. Even just an inkjet printer is just fascinating. Oracle of physics.
Electrostatic printing is the technical name.
Yeah, exactly.
For Xerox printing, yes. And I remember as a sophomore in college, 1971, going to 3M outside of Pittsburgh and working with a color copier. I had nothing to do with it. I mean, we also made computer drawings at Carnegie Mellon because it was such a big computer school, but we were just doodles. But the color copier was mind-blowing. And 3M invented something called the color and color copier, which amazing prints and what was it, up in Rochester, There's a whole slew of artists who were working with copiers in the 70s.
Yeah. One of the points I make in the book, this refers back to your point about an instant image, or the fact that a print is essentially an impression, and it could be as simple as a footprint on the beach, or as complicated as a 7-color intaglio print, which is certainly not an immediate production, but something that I say about printing that's for me very interesting is that the actual act of printing happens in a space that we can't access, because when you're printing a print in a press, it goes under the roller, or it's under the press, the platen, and you can't ever actually witness the production of the work of art. There's this sort of ontological opacity to it, and all you see when you see a print is this aftermath. So this is not the print, but this is the print. So you have to, and that's why the word pull is in the title of the book, because so much about printing, I think, is about both bringing surfaces together in contact, and everything that says about tactility and contact and adjacency and authenticity, but it's also about having to break that contact. And so there's a kind of melancholy about all prints as well, and that they're always slightly belated. So it is quick, but it's also always about something that you've missed in the process of printing. And one of the reasons that I think Xerox is so fascinating is that it's a lot like a printing press. You put a thing on a plate and you close the lid, and then something happens. But in essence, you get to witness this light moving across and seeing the print being made in the Xerox machine. So it's a way that light is allowed to kind of get into that secret space of impression. But there are so many ways that these later office printing technologies can be discussed in terms of precisely what they do to the history of print. And they also are an intersection with photography. So there's so much to be done, so much to say, and so much to learn about these processes. I got really obsessed with ditto machines last year.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, I actually am old enough to have used one.
I met a poet at a party, and I remember my wife just shook her head and walked away, because he was talking about mimeograph machines, and this group of poets works with mimeograph machines. Of course, I was fascinated by that. I want to hear more.
Right. Well, a mimeograph is a stencil, so it's related to the screen print. And so much of photography is also stencil-like and silhouette-like, and the photogram is a stencil process. Something that I do in the book that is pretty unusual in the history of print is that I spend a lot of the time talking about screen printing, which is sort of the least prestigious form of analog printmaking. There's very little out there about screen printing, and I really tried to give screen printing its due in this book. We'll see if it worked, but
this is something I've wondered about. When is silkscreen? When was it invented? I mean, I know that it has antecedents, but there was a show at Rutgers a couple of years ago. Maybe it was like the invention of 1930s silkscreen. Mm-hmm. It seems like there was a movement, silkscreen movement in the 30s.
Yeah, the 30s, especially around the WPA and social realism, there was a lot of interest in using screen printing as a kind of, both as propaganda, but also just public announcements and things. But screen printing, yes, it does have a lot of antecedents. Perhaps the most interesting antecedent is in Japanese textile printing, katagami stencils, which are these beautiful handmade stencils that are produced on a mesh made of single silk strands or single hairs. But it's a very high craft used to stencil resist print silks for mostly for kimonos. But anyway, that's just a much more time-consuming mode of printing than screen printing became. nobody really knows exactly where it began, but by the early 20th century, especially in California, it was beginning to be used, primarily in the advertising industry. So screen printing is really great for printing on fabric and glass and all kinds of stuff. And it was a method of printing things like logos on anything, on your pennants, on your team pennants. There was a big screen printing of tire covers for the back of cars.
This is how Sister Rita, the silkscreen was available to Rita Kent in the 60s because it was already, this is the other thing that I've discovered in photography, the commercial labs, and the whole reason that there are large photographs now in the art world is that commercial labs in Germany and New York are doing large fashion photographs. So the artists kind of piggyback on this technology. And the same thing, it sounds like with screen printing, it was used in sort of utilitarian functions and then artists picked it up.
Yeah. Yeah, and one of the things I sort of excavate in my chapter on screen printing is that it actually has a very interesting non-art commercial background, and that is that this silk mesh that initially made up all of these screen print matrices, that silk mesh was actually taken from the flour milling tradition in Europe, where it was a mesh that was used to sift flour in order to make white bread. So from the 18th century onward, this mesh that was being used to sift material into specially refined flours, that's exactly the same material from the same sources. It's hand loomed in Switzerland for hundreds of years. That's what people started using to sort of sift images into being in the 20th century. So it has this incredibly interesting background in other areas outside of print. And this is something that I'm also really interested in, is the way that print is ultimately, at some level, it's always impossible to differentiate it from manufacturing, from making other kinds of things in the world. One of my favorite texts these days is reading Charles Babbage's work on copying from the 1830s, and Babbage is, of course, one of the major founders of the computer revolution. He's writing about printing and the different kinds of printmaking that we're used to, lithography and relief printing, alongside things like making umbrella handles and producing back screens for fireplaces, and all of the different ways that you could get machines to make things for you. Print is very much part of that, and that's the history of print. And it's gone into this fine art stream that has become prestigious. But now we're at a point where it's just exploding back out into making things. Now we talk about 3D printing, we're printing organs, we're printing solar panels. Everything's being printed, and printing now is just a way, as a term, it's understood as a kind of, it means executing a thing, making a thing. So I'm really interested in that, actually. I think it makes fine art more interesting to think about its ties to
It's
these
replacing
other.
the word manufacture.
I think it is, actually, in some ways. It's becoming, 3D, we're designing 3D printers for the moon so that we can make the stuff we need when we go back up there. It's much easier to just print it there than put something on a rocket and bring it up there. So we're entering the digital age, but it's still very much tied to the world of print. And something that I didn't talk about in the book, but that's very interesting to me at the moment, is the link between printing and circuit printing. So we imagine that we live in this digital world, it's the end of print, and the digital world is taking over print, but in fact, the digital world runs on print. Every circuit board in every device you have has been made in a printing process. And I've been doing some research on the
Microphotolithography.
Yeah, microphotolithography, exactly.
Still analog.
Yep, it's all printmaking. And so we're still running on print in very distinct ways, yeah.
Just to veer off a little bit.
Yeah.
My wife showed her film in Wichita, Kansas. She's a filmmaker, so we went to Wichita in the fall, and I went to the local art museum because I like, when I'm in smaller towns, I like to see what the local art scene is doing. And apparently Wichita was a center of linoleum printing. And so I bought a book on the explosion of lino printing, block printing in the early 20th century. And there were chapters on America, Britain, France, Germany. But this one printer, and I've forgotten her name because I lent the book to a student and I don't have it to refer to. She was from California, and there's a whole show at the Wichita Art Museum of these beautiful color lino prints of Carmel and the California landscape in the teens. And he was a student of Arthur Wesley Dow.
Oh, yeah.
And Arthur Wesley Dow was like a forgotten figure in contemporary art because we've forgotten that he was Georgia O'Keeffe's teacher and the photographer, whose name is, I'm forgetting, the famous early modernist. But Dow and this lino print explosion, I realized if you sort of blur your eyes, they look like color photographs. So the subjects, Carmel, different landscapes, then become the sort of fodder for a kind of, well, maybe not very interesting landscape photography. Fairfield Porter being kind of apex, but still it comes out of lino prints. It was the only color medium where a civilian could make a color image. And so I thought this was like a fascinating kind of highway, maybe not the greatest work, but still fascinating medium. And lino prints, you still you can go to Blick and get all this stuff and make your own color prints. So I just love that connection. And this is where, your book has just permitted me to go look at all of this weird stuff, and it sounds like you traveled you're the pathfinder. You're miles in front of me, but it's interesting to see the world through print eyes.
Well, I think print is everywhere, and it's just not always recognized, particularly in the world of painting, actually. That's one of the things that I try to make a point about in the book, is that just because we haven't been writing about print and focusing on print as much as we should have doesn't mean it hasn't really been driving a lot of what's happening in modern and contemporary art. So if you think about an artist like Glenn Ligon, who, it's hard to think of a more prominent painter at the moment, and he's considered to be a painter. There's no question that he's a painter, but almost all of his work is fundamentally based on print and the kind of intelligence that you need to have to make a print, the kind of operations that go into print. So, you probably are familiar with his paintings made from stenciled text, where he just pushes an oil grease stick through a stencil and repeats the same sentence over and over again, moving down a canvas. Yes, it's a painting, it involves paint and it's on a canvas, but a stencil is absolutely a printing tool. Warhol is a printer. I'm sorry, but those Warhol silkscreen paintings are prints. There's almost no way that you can definitively identify those as paintings.
I call them photographs.
Oh, very good. Well, then we can really get into it. Because also there are a lot of ways in which, say, someone like Rauschenberg, his silkscreen paintings they tend to be discussed as borrowing from photography, but I would also say they're silk screens, they're borrowing from print, and it's really hard to tell these technologies apart, which is fascinating. And what I really hope we can do in the future is find more nuance and subtle ways to think about the relationship between print and photography, which is incredibly complex and interesting. And the two media really, I don't think could quite function without each other, actually.
Well, Rauschenberg is a great example because you see in the famous painting he did after Kennedy was assassinated with the astronaut and JFK. There are many examples of the Wadsworth has one, but you see him working with the three separations. So he separates the image and you get a color color silkscreen, but then you have the monochrome, the blue image, or other. So it's like he's fighting against this idea of separation.
Yeah.
And Warhol too. Warhol's his color, the flowers, the color, Marilyn's, even the shadows. It's as if he doesn't want to do separations, but he wants to go directly to color. So I gave a talk at DIA on his flowers, or his the shadow paintings as a kind of end run around CMYK, color production. But yeah, so these are, and Glenn is like, he's a monochrome artist. It's mostly black and white.
The one of my details from that Rauschenberg painting is the end paper of my book. So there are several of my own photos. Speaking of photography, I did some of the photography for the book, including the cover photograph. And I have found that if you really want to teach print and you want to convey the quality of print, you need to get down close to the object and look at it at a raking angle under raking light, so that the physicality of it, the relationship between the ink and the support, all of these things become evident. Print tends to get lost in your typical museum quality photographs that you get off of websites. So something I tell all my students, no matter what they're writing about, is take your own photographs. Don't just rely on the overhead view from the museum.
And print is probably something that needs to be seen close.
Yeah.
Because unless it's your wonderful example at the end with wood carving, the German artist.
Christiane Baumgartner.
Huge.
Yeah.
But you can see those at a distance. But most prints are. It is a kind of small, in general, a smaller art form where you have to, as everyone knows, you have to get in close.
Yeah. It's getting on a quarter till, and I should probably open it up for any questions. Does anyone have any questions? I'd love to.
So,
hands.
yeah, we can take questions, definitely. I'll ask that you wait until I bring you the microphone, just so that everything can be heard by everyone in the room. So here we go. Yeah, you can start.
Well, thank you. I can't wait to read the book, although I enjoyed the lectures very much. I have two questions, and I grabbed the mic because I have to leave in a little while. But thank you for the talk. And my first question is, did working on prints change the way in which you think about other media moving forward? And I'm also interested, when you were talking about the artist, Professor Willing, when you were talking about the artist who worked on lino cuts in Carmel, it reminded me of Elizabeth Catlett and Alison Sarr also working in that medium. And it made me wonder if any of these print media, when you were talking about maneuvers and manipulation, if any of them are particularly gendered, if there's something in print or processes that attracts different gender, maybe based on the type of labor that's required. So thank you.
Great questions, great big questions. I've absolutely, sorry, you're losing me. I've absolutely been transformed by this project. It's changed. There are too many things to name, but one thing I'll say right away is that it has totally transformed the way I see and understand color. I had a kind of pedestrian understanding of color before I did this project, but having to really think about color as a physical pile of layers and color as something that has to be assembled on the printing press in a way that's very different from the way it's used in painting, for example. It's made me much more attentive to these elements in all sorts of media, including photography, absolutely, including photography. I've always been interested in scale. I edited a whole book on scale, but it has really made me think more about the way scale works in the visual arts, and how can you know when you're looking at an image that is at actual size, or that it has been made in direct contact with another object. But I think the temporality of printmaking is what has really, is where I'm taking my work in the future. I'm not actually writing on print right now. I'm writing about the kind of ambivalent status of space imaging. particularly the status of having to wait for images, and images that are coming from a space that is strange and unfamiliar, which for me is very similar to the space of the printing press, where you put something in and it comes back out at you in reverse as if from the other side of the universe, and where you're always having to wait for a machine to process something that you can't see. So I've been moving in some pretty strange directions, but definitely from the springboard of the printing press, I would say. And then I would just say that the question of print and gender is very, very interesting to me. It's not something I focused on in any specific way, but I think that studying print, particularly historically, is a great way to break down traditional gender stereotypes about making. So just to give one example, I think there's a kind of boys' club reputation in printing presses and in print shops, particularly in the earlier part of the 20th century. There's a lot of big machinery, and it takes a lot of pressure to move things around, and it's about stamping something on a support, pressing a form into some reception, and there are all kinds of ways that could be gendered as masculine. Then again, the matrix, the thing that makes the work, the word matrix comes from the Latin for womb, and it is very much about what we might call a feminine form of making. And the fact is that actually printmaking doesn't settle easily into any specific kind of gender identity. It's a great place for sort of queering the whole idea of making images, I think.
The artist Barbara Smith, Barbara Smith. I mean, she's just as a touring retrospective that was at the LA MoCA. Anyway, she's a performance artist, but she when she was in grad school, a lot of her friends, or some of her friends, were making prints at Gemini, and she couldn't get access to Gemini, so she bought a photocopy machine and made Xeroxes, and so those were her prints. So the scale of electrostatic printing, I know there's a catalog from Visual Studies Workshop with, it's not only women, but there are a lot of women who are working with color Xerox in the 70s. Very interesting medium.
Hi, thank you all so much, Jim and Jennifer. I will recommend the Mellon lectures. If you are an art nerd like me, it's like binge watchable. It really is. You can really stay up all night with it. And what was number 4 called? Was that not interference?
Strain.
Strain.
Strain was the screen. That's
Strain.
chapter 4. I
So,
think, yeah, the screen printing chapter.
I have a bunch of questions, and I'm going to choose to ask at the same time. So, in strain, you take the word strain, even the word separation, I think was like number 3, and you apply that word to cultural, kind of bring it outside of the art making practice and use the word for like cultural strain or separation. You even said like about separation of race. And so I'm really curious about your how you navigate that and where that comes from. I think in strain you used Ed Bruchet, and that I kind of thought you really went out on a limb there, but you really pulled it back in. I really recognized, wow, these processes are very cultural, even though they're applied to an artistic process. And so could you succinctly talk about your transference from this artistic practice, these terms that describe artistic practice, and how they are also metaphors for our cultural situation? And the second question is, something about print shops is they form a community.
Right.
That's every artist who's ever worked in one or near one knows that the print shop is not a solo operation, it's a community.
Yeah.
And could you talk about how that maybe has ramifications through art over the ages.
Yeah, absolutely. So first, the metaphor question, the question of terminology. I'm glad you asked that question. It's really central to the way the book is organized and the way I've been thinking about how to talk about making in an art historical sphere or in a cultural sphere. Making is the things that happen in artist studios, processes of bringing an object into the world, art object or otherwise, are often identified as being in the realm of tacit intelligence, which means basically intelligence that sits outside of consciousness and outside of language, and that it is somehow in this other realm where language can't go and where language can't reach. And as someone who has made things and has spent a lot of time thinking about the question of skill, I think that it is true that works of art and that the process of making is outside of the language that we know and can't be easily or definitively described, can't be mapped easily with language. But that doesn't mean that we don't have a responsibility to try to connect with that action, with using language. I don't agree that art shouldn't be written about and shouldn't be talked about, obviously, or else I wouldn't be an art historian. But how do you do it though? How do you make connections between operating tools and manipulating matter with these big theoretical and cultural questions that the people in the humanities think about? When I started getting interested in making, I worked with a couple of friends of mine at Harvard and elsewhere where we developed this project called the Maneuvers Project. And that was really the core of some of these terms that are at the basis of this book. And what we tried to do was learn about making and connect different spheres of making together through identifying really very basic maneuvers or operations that people use to make things across many different spheres. So for example, we had a workshop where it was all about different kinds of cutting. That was just, the name of the workshop was just cutting. And on the same day, we visited a sawmill in south of Boston and watched a guy take a tree apart. And then we went to a neurobiology lab at Harvard and watched a guy slice mouse brain into 30 nanometer slices and use that to map the neural connections in the brain. And we were all stunned by how much similarity there was between the way these two makers were thinking. And it was something we had a few of these workshops. We had one on turning where we did everything from throwing pots on a wheel to having a DJ teach us about turntabling, to thinking about early cinema, to thinking about making things on a lathe. So we were trying to identify these really very basic movements that had words attached to them, and the words allowed us to connect. The movements connected different kinds of making, and the words then helped us think about all of the ways in which those kinds of operations have filtered through language and become part of literature and thought and discourse, over the centuries. So you think about the word reversal, and you think of reversal of fortune, or all of the ways in which reversal runs through poetry, from the outset. So we were looking for these really basic terms that would be transitive in that sense. And essentially, that was such a successful operation. It was so stimulating, at least for me. I mean, the fact that we were able to get people around the table who would never be at the same conference. Like, you would just not have a sawmill operator and a neurobiologist. There is no academic conference where that would happen. And so we were trying to build these kinds of connections. And so that was really what I brought over to the print world, was what are the terms that could do that for me when I want to open up printmaking. And it is a metaphorization, absolutely. But my answer, I don't think that's a problem. First of all, I mean, everything is all language is metaphorical at some level. And the old ways of talking about print are also metaphorical, but they have just, some of those metaphors have just ossified to the extent that we don't see them anymore. So the notion that print is reproductive, there's all kinds of metaphors that are attached to reproduction, obviously. But there's so much more we can say, literally, about print if we just use different metaphors. I guess that would be, and you had two questions. The other one was
Sorry.
Absolutely. Bye, Thea. Absolutely. Community, that's one of the things that I'm so interested in with printmaking, and one of the reasons that I like the idea of really looking at how prints are made, because when we think about print and the social, if you're just thinking about reproduction and dissemination, the community you're thinking about is the social community that's built by, print, for example. So communities are made by prints getting out in the world and everyone reading the same thing or everyone looking at the same thing. But there's also so much community being built in the print shop. It's about reliance on different kinds of skills. If you're an artist and you go to Gemini or you go to any of these major print studios and get prints, work with printers and make prints, you instantly have to give up any fantasy of the lone genius artist. And there's a lot of discomfort that comes out of that in print studios sometimes. But the collaborativeness of it is great, and you're also collaborating with this machine, the press, which is very much part of the operation as well.
It's so suggestive and interesting because I still come back to what is a print, which is why this is so interesting. The old-fashioned view was, insofar as it was faithfully reproducing an original, it was a good print.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Of course, that could be done by someone painting an original, like painting from an original painting,
Right.
but that wouldn't be considered a print if they were painting from an original painting. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
Reproducing. So
Right.
is print by definition something that is done reproducing an original by machine? And it also, for instance, if Warhol takes a silk screen of an original
Yeah.
and then shakes it and makes it different, then he's making an original, not a print, not a reproduction.
Okay, so this is great, and I think the definition of a print in this book, the one that I use, is that a print is made by transferring an image between two surfaces that come in contact. That's it. It's basically an impression. I'm more interested in print as a form of impression. It doesn't have to be reproductive. And in fact, in the print world, there are prints that are made after paintings. Those are called reproductive prints. I think that's what you're basically talking about. It's like when you want to reproduce a unique work of art, you make a reproduction of it through printing. But you can also make prints where the artist is sitting there in front of the copper plate and makes an original composition on the copper plate, and then that gets printed, and you're making a reproduction of a different kind of original that was never meant to exist in any other medium other than print. So there's a kind of privacy about print in that sense. And then there are all kinds of processes like monotype, which is, of course, one of my favorites, where no copies are made of anything. You can spend your whole life as a printmaker and never make a copy of anything. You can just squash things in the press, basically. Yeah. So different institutions with different interests have different definitions of what a print is. In the museum world, they really do insist on the fact that it's a reproducible image, that multiple copies are made of whatever the original is. I don't even insist on that in this book. Yeah.
I had a rule in my class last semester. It was called "Don't throw that out." we were working in the print lab for a couple of weeks, and I remember I threw something out. My student said, "Hey, Jim, pull that out of the trash." So I had to put it back together.
Yeah.
But don't throw it out. Just in the print lab is something that I mean, in fact, I wish that I had more like bad back transfer prints or misregistered prints because, or just working proofs. I mean, it seems like people don't save those things, which are so
Right.
instrumental in terms
Right.
of how some images are assembled, things like that.
Yeah. And museums don't save them, which is, to my chagrin, because so I teach at Harvard, and the print collection there is amazing, and the print curators have been terrific, but I really just want a big collection of misprints so that I can teach my students how things are made,
One of the
get
most,
past the perfection.
one of the most remarkable reproductions in the book is it's a photograph on wood for an engraver to carve. And it's from your collection. I think it's so fantastic. You see a wooden engraving in probably late 19th century. You always wonder how Harper's got those incredible images, but they were partially photographed.
Yeah, yeah. And that's one of the many things going on in the later 19th century where photography and printmaking are brushing up against each other in really interesting ways. All kinds of new processes are being invented, many of which have been lost or nearly lost. So there's a lot of dissertations there for people to resurrect some of that material. Yeah. But printmaking is something. Just to say a couple words about the importance of making. As an art historian, if you want to write about print, if you really want to understand print, I really think you have to get in there and make some prints. It's not only because you learn about how difficult it is, but also because it's just almost impossible to literally understand what's happening, especially with these questions of reversal, without having some experience making prints. So I teach a class now, and I've taught this class for 3 years now, with the artist Matt Saunders, who teaches studio at Harvard, and we're attempting to do a truly hybrid studio history theory class. So 3 hours a week, we're in the print studio making prints. 3 hours a week, we're in the study rooms in the Art Museum, looking at brocheted prints and reading theory and history. And the students have to do a print project at the end and do the final crit, do the whole thing. And then they also have to write a paper. And it is fantastic. I love this class so much because I'm learning so much, and this book is largely an attempt to sort of convey some of the excitement of learning and teaching across this divide between making and art history. And the students, some of them are PhD students in art history, some of them are PhD students in physics, and then undergraduate studio majors as well. And it's a really good idea for an art history student to have to go through a final crit. Let's put it that way. There are tears,
Yeah.
but yeah.
Okay, I think we should thank our guests for being here. Thank you very much.